Single mother agrees to Bathe Millionaire who lost his mobility to make ends meet. But what happened left her in shock. Thomas Crawford was a man admired and envied by many. At 35, he had amassed a fortune that seemed unshakable and built a reputation as both a ruthless businessman and a charming gentleman. His extravagant lifestyle frequently landed him in the headlines, and his recent relationship with Emily Harris, a stunning 28-year-old, only added fuel to the media frenzy. Emily, with her breathtaking beauty and ambitious demeanor, appeared to be the perfect match for Thomas. Yet, while he was deeply infatuated with her, there was something in the way she spoke about their future that cast a faint shadow of doubt over his heart. Before continuing, make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. That afternoon, as they drove along the winding roads of the picturesque Napa Valley, Emily returned to the subject that seemed to dominate her thoughts lately: marriage. Her voice was sweet, but her words carried an undeniable urgency. She spoke of dates, extravagant venues, and endless guest lists. Thomas, gripping the wheel of his sleek, state-of-the-art sports car, smirked faintly and tried to reassure her, suggesting they savor the trip without rushing into such significant discussions. But Emily persisted, her tone edging toward insistence. "Thomas, you know how much this wedding means to me. We can't keep postponing it. I need to start organizing everything. It's not something you can just throw together overnight." He sighed, keeping his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Emily, we've talked about this. I want everything to be perfect, but perfection takes time. Let's just enjoy this trip. Just the two of us, no pressure." She crossed her arms, turning her gaze to the passing landscape. The silence that settled between them was heavy, almost tangible. Thomas felt a pang in his chest. He loved Emily, or at least he believed he did, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she was more enamored with what he could provide than with who he truly was. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, the screech of tires broke the road's quiet serenity. Thomas instinctively jerked the wheel as an oncoming truck veered into their lane. The sports car spun out of control, Emily's scream piercing the air as they were violently tossed side to side. A deafening crash sent them hurtling into the metal guardrail, and the world around them dissolved into chaos. When the car finally came to a stop, shrouded in smoke and shattered glass, Emily was the first to regain consciousness. Her hands trembled as she unfastened her seatbelt, quickly inspecting her body. Apart from a few cuts and bruises, she was unharmed. "Thomas!" she cried, turning to him. Thomas was motionless, his head slumped slightly to the side. A deep gash above his brow sent a trickle of blood down his face. Panic consumed Emily as she shook his arm, her eyes wide with terror. "Thomas, please, say something." The next few minutes were a whirlwind of sirens and hurried voices. Paramedics arrived swiftly, carefully extracting Thomas from the wreckage. He was still breathing but unresponsive. Emily, clutching her purse tightly, stood in a daze, watching as they placed him on a stretcher and loaded him into the ambulance. The flashing red and blue lights reflected on her face as police officers questioned her about what had happened. Her answers were brief, almost automatic. The scene felt like a blur. Hours later, at the hospital, Emily paced back and forth in the waiting room, the clicking of her heels echoing against the cold floor. Finally, a doctor appeared, his expression somber. "Miss Harris," he called, and she hurried toward him. "Your boyfriend is stable, but there's been significant damage to his spinal cord. He's not responding to stimuli in his legs. We'll need further tests, but there's a high possibility he's permanently lost movement." Emily raised her hands to her mouth, her face contorted in a mix of shock and horror. "Permanently?" she stammered. The doctor nodded, his face bearing the calm compassion of his profession. "Yes, but we'll do everything we can to ensure he has the best quality of life. We'll monitor him closely over the next few hours, When Emily entered Thomas's room, the sight of him made her pause. He looked so fragile, so different from the confident, invincible man she had always known. Sitting beside him, she held his hand but found herself at a loss for words. As her thoughts spiraled chaotically, she began questioning what her life would look like from this moment forward. Thomas slowly opened his eyes, the weight of an unfamiliar reality settling heavily on him. The sterile, silent hospital room felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. His body was heavy, almost numb, but something felt terribly wrong. Instinctively, he tried to move his legs, but nothing happened. A wave of panic swept over him, and his now wide eyes met Emily's tense expression as she sat by his side. "Emily," his voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "What happened? Why can't I?" She hesitated, swallowing hard. "Thomas, there was an accident. The doctor said that you might have lost movement in your legs." Her voice faltered, and she averted her gaze, unable to face the weight of her own words. The seconds that followed felt like an endless descent into an abyss. Thomas stared at the ceiling, his mind spiraling. No, this can't be," he muttered, his voice growing louder, tinged with disbelief. "I'm going to walk. This is temporary, right? They can fix this, can't they?" He turned his head to look directly at Emily, desperately searching for reassurance. Emily, visibly uncomfortable, gave a slight shrug. "The doctor said there's a small chance, but he can't guarantee anything." Thomas closed his eyes, feeling a wave of despair and anger swell within his chest. He had always been a man of action, a conqueror of challenges. Accepting that something like this could be permanent seemed impossible. His breathing grew uneven, and he clenched his fists, feeling powerless for the first time in his life. The doctor entered the room shortly after, breaking the heavy silence. He calmly explained the extent of the spinal cord damage, detailing the possibilities of rehabilitation and treatment, but his words of reassurance fell on deaf ears. To Thomas, it all felt distant, as though he were listening to someone talk about someone else entirely. After the doctor left, the room returned to silence. Emily stood up to adjust her coat, glancing nervously at her watch. I have some things to take care of, but I'll be back later. Okay?" she said, forcing a smile before slipping out quickly, not waiting for a response. Thomas was left alone, staring into the emptiness. Emily's absence, the weight of her words, and the coldness of the moment hit him hard. He had been used to being admired, desired, and invincible. Now everything felt fragile, including the people around him. The days in the hospital passed in a haze for Thomas, marked by tests, initial physical therapy sessions, and sporadic visits from Emily. Although she visited regularly, there was a sense of detachment in her presence, as though she was there out of obligation. Thomas began to realize that the woman he had thought he would share his life with no longer seemed as close, but he was too exhausted, physically and emotionally, to confront her. On the morning of his discharge, Thomas was transferred to his mansion in San Francisco, a place that had once been a haven of luxury and comfort, but now felt like a gilded cage. Emily, who had overseen the preparations for his return, made sure everything was ready. Ramps installed, a state-of-the-art wheelchair, and a bedroom adapted to his new needs. What she didn't mention was that she had hired outside help to manage the situation. When Thomas entered his newly adapted home for the first time, he was greeted by a young woman with a steady gaze and a calm smile. "Hello, Mr. Crawford. My name is Kate Miller. I'm a physical therapist and caregiver. I've been hired to assist you with your recovery and anything else you might need." Thomas gave her a cold look. He was exhausted, humiliated by his dependence, and furious at the thought of a stranger witnessing his vulnerability. "I don't need a babysitter," he said, his voice sharp. Kate, however, remained unfazed. Her tone was calm and professional. "I'm not a babysitter, sir. I'm here to help you regain control over your life. I can start by clearing some boxes to make the living room more accessible." Emily, watching the interaction from a distance, stepped in with a forced smile. "I thought this would make things easier for both of us, Thomas. I don't have the experience to take care of you. And, well, I have some important commitments to handle." Thomas looked at Emily, searching for some trace of empathy in her words, but found only practicality. He felt a knot tighten in his throat but chose not to argue. "Do whatever you think is best," he murmured, averting his gaze. In the first days, the relationship between Thomas and Kate was fraught with tension. He barely spoke to her, limiting their interactions to curt and often sharp responses. She, on the other hand, remained patient and attentive, adjusting the environment around him to ensure he was as comfortable as possible without overstepping. When he lashed out in frustration, whether because something slipped from his hands or because the physical pain drained him, Kate stayed composed. "I know this is hard, Mr. Crawford," she would say, her voice steady yet comforting. "But we'll get through it one step at a time." Nighttime was the hardest for Thomas. The echoes of silence in his mansion amplified the loneliness he felt. Emily spent less and less time at home, always citing commitments, and when she was there, she seemed distracted. He saw in her someone who no longer belonged to his new reality but didn't know how to confront it. Kate, despite her dedication, never crossed the boundaries of her role. Her gestures were always professional. Yet there was something in her tone and the way she encouraged him that began to soften the walls Thomas had built around himself. Emily's growing detachment became increasingly apparent as days passed. At first, she had made a point of being by Thomas's side, at least to maintain the appearance of support. Now, her commitments multiplied, and her evening outings became more frequent. Thomas felt the void her absence left more keenly with each passing day but avoided addressing it directly. Part of him still wanted to believe she was coping with the situation in her own way, but another part, the one he didn't want to acknowledge, knew that Emily no longer saw him as the man he once was. One particularly difficult night, Thomas, confined to his wheelchair in the large, silent living room of the mansion, decided to invite Emily to spend some time together. He waited for her in the sitting room, his eyes fixed on the clock on the wall. When she finally walked through the door, carrying a designer handbag and engrossed in her phone, he called out to her, "Emily, can we watch a movie tonight? Just the two of us. Like we used to." His voice was almost hesitant, carrying a mix of hope and need. She lifted her eyes from her phone for a brief moment, as if surprised by his request, but quickly shook her head. "I can't, Thomas. I have a commitment tonight. It's important." He stared at her, frustration building in his chest. What could possibly be so important at this hour? "It feels like you're always busy. Anywhere but here." Emily sighed, visibly irritated, and slipped her phone into her bag. "Thomas, you don't understand. My life has changed too. This isn't easy for me either. I need to get out, to distract myself." "Distract yourself from what?" "From me." His voice grew firmer, tinged with hurt. "If you don't want to be here anymore, just say it. Don't bother with excuses." "I'm not making anything up," she replied, raising her voice. "I'm trying to deal with all of this. It's not my fault that you're always like this." The word hung in the air like a blade. "Like this?" Thomas repeated, his anger mingling with the evident pain on his face. "I lost the ability to move, Emily, not my dignity. You're supposed to be here with me." Emily averted her gaze, adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder. "I already told you I can't tonight. Maybe tomorrow." And before he could respond, she walked out the door without looking back. The silence that followed was unbearable. Thomas felt the weight of his new reality pressing down even harder, like he was sinking in quicksand. He felt rejected, humiliated, and utterly alone. Not long after, Kate appeared, carrying a small bowl of popcorn. "Mr. Crawford, I heard some voices. Is everything all right? She noticed his expression and softened her tone. If not, maybe I can help. Thomas looked at her for a moment, as if unsure whether to accept her offer. Do you like old movies? He asked, breaking the silence. Kate smiled. I love them. I have a soft spot for 1950s mysteries. She set the popcorn on the table and began browsing through the television catalog. Without realizing it, her simple gesture brought a bit of comfort to Thomas, who allowed her presence in that moment. They spent the evening watching and talking, Kate's soft laughter breaking through the darkness that seemed to envelop the house. For the first time in weeks, Thomas felt a flicker of normalcy, something he thought he had lost forever. The following days brought a strange shift to the routine in the mansion. Thomas became increasingly aware of Emily's absence, but at the same time, Kate's steady and calming presence started to create a new sense of balance in his life. She was discreet but attentive, always finding ways to make things just a little easier for him, whether by rearranging furniture to improve his mobility or bringing small distractions to lighten the weight of the days. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the mansion's large windows, Kate appeared holding a chessboard. I thought you might enjoy a challenge, Mr. Crawford, she said with a faint smile, placing the board on the table in front of him. Thomas looked at the game, hesitant at first. It's been years since I've played, he admitted, but there was a hint of renewed curiosity in his tone. They spent much of the morning playing, chatting between moves. Kate proved to be a formidable opponent, drawing a genuine smile from Thomas for the first time in weeks. You're good at this, he said, leaning slightly forward in his wheelchair as he moved a piece. Better than I expected. I must admit, my father was an excellent player. He taught me when I was a child, Kate replied, her voice tinged with nostalgia. Thomas noticed a different sparkle in her eyes as she spoke, something that made her seem more real, more relatable. As the day progressed, their relationship felt less formal. Thomas, who had previously kept a defensive distance, began to feel more at ease with Kate's presence. She wasn't intrusive, but she also didn't back down in the face of his frustrations. When he grew irritated with his own limitations, she responded calmly, offering words that always seemed to hit the right note. That evening, with Emily still not back home, Thomas found himself in the living room with Kate once again. They talked about movies, music, and even the trips he had taken before the accident. Kate's ability to listen without judgment made him feel more human, less like a shadow of the man he used to be. However, the void left by Emily still gnawed at him. He couldn't understand how someone who claimed to love him could be so absent during such a difficult time. In contrast, Kate's dedication seemed almost selfless, which confused him even more. He found himself wondering how someone so young, with her own challenges, could be so present and patient. In that moment, Thomas realized he had begun to look forward to his time with Kate, small islands of normalcy in a sea of uncertainty. A week later, Kate appeared in Thomas's makeshift office, where he was attempting to pass the time by reviewing documents from his company. Her expression was more serious than usual, immediately catching his attention. Kate, is something wrong? He asked, concerned. She hesitated, clutching the clipboard she often carried. Her fingers nervously fidgeted with the edge of the paper, something Thomas noticed right away. It was rare to see her so unsettled. Mr. Crawford, Thomas, she began, addressing him by his first name without the usual formality. I need to talk to you about something important. He set the papers aside and gestured for her to continue. Go ahead. Kate took a deep breath before speaking. I have a daughter, Lily. She's 5 years old and has been staying with my mother since I took this job. But she misses me a lot, and I miss her too. Her voice wavered slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. I took this job because I really needed it, but I can't ignore how much it's affecting my daughter. So, I've decided I need to resign. For a moment, the office was enveloped in a suffocating silence. Thomas stared at Kate, absorbing her words. It felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Since the accident, she had become a constant in his life, someone he could rely on without hesitation. The thought of losing that stability left him feeling utterly disoriented. Resignation, he repeated, as if the word were foreign to him. Kate, you're the only person who knows how to deal with me. Who else could take your place? She gave him a sad smile. I'm sure someone else will be able to help you. You're much stronger than you think, Thomas. And what about your daughter? You mentioned that her father isn't around. He hesitated before continuing, clearly treading on delicate ground. You're doing all of this on your own, aren't you? Kate nodded, her gaze dropping to her hands. Yes. He left when he found out I was pregnant. Since then, I've been doing my best to take care of Lily. But that means sometimes I have to make tough choices. Thomas felt a mix of admiration and sadness as he listened. He couldn't imagine the strength it took to endure everything she was going through while remaining so dedicated to her work. Kate, he said, his voice softer now, could you at least give me one more week? Just so I can prepare for this. She looked surprised by the request but eventually agreed. One more week, but please understand, I can't extend it beyond that. Thomas nodded, but his mind was already racing with possibilities. He knew he didn't want to lose her, not just because of the practical help, but because she had become an anchor in the chaos of his life. After Kate left the office, Thomas remained seated in silence, staring into the void. For the first time in a long while, he realized just how much he relied on her, not only physically but emotionally. The thought of her leaving felt like a weight he wasn't sure he could bear. That same evening, Thomas decided he needed to speak with Emily. He waited until he heard the distinct sound of her heels clicking in the mansion's entryway, followed by the firm slam of the front door. She was on the phone, laughing at something, but ended the conversation when she saw him in the living room, seated in his wheelchair with a serious and determined expression. Thomas? Why are you still up? She asked, surprised. It's late, you should be resting. He ignored her question and gestured for her to sit on the sofa across from him. Reluctantly, Emily complied, still holding her phone. We need to talk, he said, his voice firm but measured. She raised her eyebrows, as though taken aback by his tone. All right, about what? Thomas took a deep breath before speaking. I'm not blind, Emily. I know you've been spending less and less time here. I know something has changed between us. She crossed her arms and averted her gaze. Thomas, that's not fair. I'm trying to deal with all of this in my own way. Your way is avoiding me, going out every night without even telling me where you're going. The frustration in his voice was now unmistakable. The truth, Emily, that's all I want. She stayed silent for a few moments, but her fidgeting fingers betrayed her unease. I don't know what you're talking about, she finally said, though her tone sounded defensive. Thomas leaned forward slightly in his wheelchair, his eyes locked on hers. Then what's this? He grabbed her phone from the nearby table and, before she could react, opened the messages he had already seen. There they were, conversations with her friends, full of complaints and disdain. The words that hurt him the most echoed in his mind. I can't stand living with him anymore, but as long as he's paying for my lifestyle, I'm not going anywhere. Emily tried to snatch the phone back, but he held it firmly. Do you think I deserve this? After everything we've been through? After everything I've done for you? She finally dropped the pretense. Thomas, you've changed. Everything has changed. I'm not the one who should feel guilty for wanting more out of life. More out of life, he repeated, incredulous. I got hurt, Emily. I lost the use of my legs, and you couldn't even truly be there for me. She stood, adjusting her bag on her shoulder in a reflexive gesture. I don't have to listen to this. You know I'm not the kind of person who can live like this. Then go, he said, his voice cold and steady. Pack your things and go. I don't want anyone here out of obligation. Emily hesitated, as if waiting for him to change his mind, but she said nothing more. She simply turned and headed upstairs, leaving Thomas motionless, feeling a strange mix of relief and emptiness. Sometime later, he heard the front door slam shut again. This time, he knew she wasn't coming back. The silence that followed was deeper than ever, but, strangely, it also brought a sense of freedom. For the first time, Thomas felt like he was taking control of something in his life, even if it meant confronting his loneliness head-on. The next morning, the mansion felt even emptier. The hurried steps of Emily, the click of her heels, and her always slightly too loud voice no longer echoed through the halls. Thomas, though relieved to have finally closed that chapter, felt the weight of the silence. The decision to push Emily away had been the right one, but it left an exposed wound. He wondered how he had let their relationship deteriorate to this point. It was as if the accident hadn't just taken his mobility, but had also stripped away the illusions he had about the life he thought he was building. As he processed these emotions in his room, Kate appeared. Unlike other days, she seemed hesitant as she entered. "Good morning, Thomas," she said, her tone softer than usual. "Is everything all right? I noticed Emily left last night and didn't come back." He looked up at her, trying to gauge if there was any judgment in her voice, but he found only genuine concern. "I told her to leave," he said simply, letting the words hang in the air. Kate pulled up a chair and sat across from him, something she rarely did without being invited. "And how are you feeling about that?" she asked, her gaze penetrating beyond the words, as if trying to understand something deeper. Thomas took his time to respond. He knew Kate wasn't there to judge him, but being honest required an effort he was still learning to make. "Part of me feels relieved. Emily hadn't really been part of my life for a while, even when she was here, but part of me feels like I failed. Like the accident didn't just break my body. It broke everything around me." Kate leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees. "You haven't failed, Thomas. Life changes in ways we can't control. What matters is what we do with those changes." She paused, choosing her words carefully before continuing. "And from what I've seen so far, you have a strength you might not even realize yet." Her words lingered with him. Kate always seemed to have something encouraging to say, but this time, her words didn't feel like an empty cliché. He realized that even in his vulnerability, she saw something in him that he had forgotten existed. Later that same day, Thomas asked Kate to take him outside. The idea of staying cooped up in the mansion felt suffocating, and he felt the need for some fresh air. She prepared the wheelchair and helped him down the newly installed ramp at the front entrance. The day was surprisingly beautiful, with a light breeze and a clear sky. Kate guided him to the garden, a space he had rarely visited, even before the accident. "I used to come here to think," he said as Kate adjusted the chair so he could get a better view of the landscape. "But lately, I'd forgotten this place even existed." "It's a good place to start over," Kate replied with a smile. "Sometimes nature has a way of reminding us about the simple, important things." Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, letting the breeze brush against his face. The gentle warmth of the sun and the distant sound of birds brought a peace he hadn't realized he needed. When he opened his eyes again, he looked at Kate, who was watching him in silence, as if waiting for him to say more. "Thank you," he said simply. She raised her eyebrows, surprised. "For what?" "For being here," he replied sincerely. "I don't say this often, but you've made this bearable. I know it hasn't been easy, but thank you." Kate smiled, a subtle but meaningful smile. "That's what I'm here for," she said, though her tone suggested there was more behind her words. The following days brought a subtle shift to Thomas's routine. Without Emily around, the mansion felt calmer, yet emptier. He missed having someone to share the small moments of daily life with. However, that void began to be filled, unexpectedly, by Kate. She remained discreet, but her actions had a profound impact. One afternoon, while Thomas was in his office trying to reorganize company documents, Kate appeared with a tray of tea and a plate of homemade cookies. "I thought a break might help," she said, placing the tray on the desk with her usual understated smile. Thomas looked at her for a moment before replying. "Are you always this thoughtful with your patients?" "Only the ones who need a bit more encouragement," she replied playfully yet respectfully. "Besides, I thought these cookies might remind you that life has its small pleasures." He chuckled lightly, something he hadn't done in a long time. Picking up a cookie, he looked at her curiously. "Did you make these?" "Yes. My daughter loves them," she said, and for a moment, her expression softened even more. When she mentioned Lily, there was a sparkle in her eyes that Thomas had noticed before. He hesitated before asking, "How is she?" "Your daughter. It must be hard being away from her." Kate sat down in the chair beside him, something she rarely did. "It's been difficult, yes," she admitted. "Lily is such a joyful child, but she misses me, and I miss her. Sometimes, I lie awake at night wondering if I made the right decision taking this job." "You clearly did," Thomas said almost instinctively. "I don't know where I'd be if you weren't here." He noticed the slight blush rising on Kate's cheeks and quickly looked away. "I mean, you've been essential." Kate smiled, a shy but grateful smile. "It's nice to hear that. Sometimes, it's easy to forget the impact we have on people's lives." For a moment, the two sat in silence, not an uncomfortable silence, but one filled with mutual understanding. Then, something unexpected happened. Thomas, who rarely initiated anything outside his routine, said, "Bring your daughter here. Let her live with you. I have more than enough space, and it doesn't make sense for you two to be apart." Kate widened her eyes, clearly surprised. "Thomas, that's very kind, but I can't accept. It wouldn't be appropriate." "Why not?" he countered. "You already do so much for me. This would be my way of giving something back. And, to be honest, I could probably use a bit of her energy around here. This house. It's too big for just me." Kate seemed torn. He could see in her expression that she wanted to accept, but something was holding her back. "I need to think about it," she said finally, standing up. "Thank you, really. It's a generous offer, but I need some time to decide." Thomas nodded, respecting her hesitation, though he felt lighter for having made the offer. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he could be useful to someone, that he could make a positive difference in another person's life. Kate's reluctance to accept Thomas's offer lingered over the next few days, but he gave her space and didn't bring it up again. Even so, something had shifted in the mansion's atmosphere. Thomas felt as though he had planted a seed, a possibility for joy that extended beyond his own needs. He couldn't quite explain why the thought of Lily being there felt so natural, but he sensed that her presence could bring life to a house that had been so quiet for so long. On Saturday afternoon, Kate finally revisited the subject. She found him in the garden, where he had been spending more time since his earlier visit there. He was sitting under one of the trees, watching the leaves sway in the wind, when she approached. Her expression was serious, but there was a softness in her eyes. "Thomas, about what you proposed," she began, sitting on a nearby bench. He turned his chair slightly to face her, curious and perhaps hopeful. "I've thought a lot about it. I talked with my mother and, most importantly, I reflected on what would be best for Lily." He remained silent, letting her continue. Kate took a deep breath before speaking again. "The truth is, Lily misses me more than I realized. Every time I talk to her on the phone, it's like she's holding back tears, and it's breaking my heart. So, I've decided to accept your offer." Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders, something he hadn't even realized he was carrying. A genuine smile spread across his face. "You won't regret it," he said. "She'll be very welcome here." Kate smiled, though there was still a hint of uncertainty in her expression. "I just want to make sure this won't be a burden for you. Bringing a child into this house changes everything." "Kate," he said, the firmness in his voice cutting through any doubt. This house needs change. I need change. And from what you've told me about Lily, I think she's exactly what this place needs." She laughed softly, relieved. "Then it's decided. I'll pick her up next week." The days leading up to Lily's arrival were filled with a new kind of energy. Kate seemed lighter, more animated, and Thomas noticed she smiled more often. As for him, he began thinking about ways to make the house more welcoming for the little girl. He requested one of the bedrooms to be decorated in vibrant colors, placed board games in the living room, and even ordered a small bicycle, knowing Lily might prefer playing in the garden. On the day Kate returned with her daughter, the mansion felt transformed. Lily, a little girl with curly brown hair and curious eyes, walked through the door with a mix of shyness and excitement. She held tightly to her mother's hand as she looked around, as if exploring a completely new world. "You must be the famous Lily," Thomas said, smiling as he watched her closely. He felt nervous, something he rarely experienced, but the girl simply nodded, her face lighting up with a shy smile. "Are you Mommy's friend?" Lily asked, her sweet voice filling the room. Thomas chuckled softly. "I suppose I might be." Kate, standing beside her, watched the interaction with a mixture of relief and joy. It was clear that Lily was already starting to feel comfortable, something Kate had feared might take longer. That evening, as Kate tucked Lily into bed in the newly decorated room, Thomas felt something stir in his heart. The mansion felt alive again, as if this small piece of innocence and joy had filled a void he hadn't even realized was there. In the days that followed, Lily brought a sense of newness to the mansion. Her laughter echoed through the hallways, filling the empty spaces with a vibrant energy that neither adult could ignore. On her first morning, she explored the garden with contagious enthusiasm, pointing out flowers, bugs, and even the marble fountain in the center. Thomas watched her from the veranda, fascinated by how something so simple could bring so much joy. Kate, meanwhile, seemed more at peace. Lily's presence gave her a serenity she hadn't fully shown before. During breakfast, Lily told stories about school, her friends, and even her grandmother. Thomas listened attentively, feeling like part of a dynamic that seemed almost familiar. It was strange, but also comforting. One afternoon, while Kate was busy with tasks in the kitchen, Lily wandered into the library where Thomas often spent his time. She entered slowly, carrying a small, colorful notebook. "Can I stay here with you?" she asked, her timid expression quickly giving way to a hopeful smile. Thomas smiled and gestured to a nearby armchair. "Of course. What do you have there?" "My drawing book," she said, opening the pages carefully. "I like to draw things I see. Yesterday I drew the garden. Do you want to see?" He leaned forward, intrigued. The drawings were childlike but full of life. There were flowers, trees, and even his wheelchair, sketched in simple but unmistakable strokes. "Is that me?" he asked, pointing at the figure. "Yes," she replied matter-of-factly. "You're the owner of the garden. My mom said you let us live here, so I think it's like you're the king of the garden." Thomas laughed, a genuine sound that surprised even himself. "King of the garden? I don't think anyone's ever called me that before." "Well, that's what you look like," she said with a casual shrug. "But you don't have a crown." He shook his head, amused. "I guess I'll need to get one." Kate appeared moments later, pausing in the doorway to watch the scene. She didn't say anything, but her smile was evident. Seeing Thomas and Lily interact so naturally filled her with quiet happiness. It felt like bringing her daughter there had been the right decision. In the days that followed, Thomas and Lily grew even closer. They played board games, drew pictures together, and even established a nightly reading routine. Kate often found the two laughing about something, a sight that eased her mind more and more each day. The bond between them was genuine, and it started to subtly transform Thomas and Kate's relationship as well. Although they maintained a professional demeanor, there was something different in the looks they exchanged, a quiet understanding that their lives were now more intertwined than ever. Life in the mansion slowly began to take on a rhythm Thomas had never envisioned for himself. Lily, with her boundless energy, turned every day into a new adventure. One afternoon, while Kate was preparing lunch, Thomas and Lily were in the garden, playing cards on a wooden table under the shade of a large tree. The game had confusing rules entirely made up by Lily, but Thomas went along with it, laughing at her elaborate explanations. "You're cheating," he teased, raising an eyebrow. "No, I'm not," Lily protested with a mischievous smile. "That's how the game works." "Ah, I see," he replied, pretending to be serious. "So, you're the boss of the game?" "I am," she declared triumphantly, before bursting into laughter. Kate appeared in the doorway, watching the scene for a moment before calling out to them. "Lunch is ready. Go wash your hands." As Lily ran ahead, Thomas maneuvered his wheelchair toward the ramp leading into the house. He didn't notice Kate waiting at the door until she stepped closer and held it open for him. "She's having so much fun here," Kate remarked with a soft smile. "Thank you for this, Thomas. For everything." "You don't need to thank me," he replied, looking directly at her. "Having you and Lily here has done more for me than anything I could have imagined." Kate seemed a bit surprised by the sincerity of his words, but before she could respond, Lily came running back to retrieve something she had forgotten. "Mommy, did you see my drawing?" she asked, holding up a colorful picture of Thomas, Kate, and herself together in the garden. "It's us. We're a team." Thomas and Kate exchanged a glance that carried more meaning than words could convey. In that moment, he realized that their presence hadn't just transformed his house. It had reshaped the way he viewed his own life. Later that evening, as Kate tucked Lily into bed, Thomas remained in the living room, lost in thought. He had never envisioned himself as part of something so simple yet profoundly meaningful. Lily's laughter, Kate's dedication, even the casual conversations at the table, all of it had brought a sense of purpose he hadn't realized he was missing. When Kate came downstairs, he called her over to sit on the couch. "Kate, can I ask you something?" he said after a moment of silence. "Of course," she replied, slightly curious. "How have you managed to stay so strong through all of this? Raising Lily on your own, handling everything, and still being so present?" She seemed surprised by the question but gave a small smile. "I don't think I'm that strong. I've had hard moments, many of them. But when you have someone who depends on you, like Lily depends on me, you just find a way to keep going. I don't think it's strength, it's love." Her words hit him hard, but in an unexpectedly comforting way. He realized that the strength she spoke of, driven by love, was something he was beginning to understand. And though he didn't want to admit it to himself in that moment, he knew he was starting to feel something deeper for Kate. The days passed peacefully, and Thomas began noticing subtle but significant changes within himself. He no longer viewed each morning as an unbearable challenge, but as an opportunity to reconnect with something greater than his limitations. This change, he knew, was a direct result of Kate and Lily's presence in his life. One afternoon, after a physical therapy session with Kate, Thomas sat in his room, gazing at his reflection in the mirror. He no longer saw just a broken man, but someone slowly reclaiming something that even his wealth hadn't been able to fill. When Kate knocked on the door, carrying a glass of water, he turned to her, resolute. "Kate, I need to say something," he began, his voice steadier than he had expected. She stepped further into the room, curious, and sat in a nearby chair. "Of course, Thomas." "What is it?" she asked, her expression calm but with a slight touch of concern. He hesitated for a moment, organizing his thoughts. "Since you and Lily came here, my life has completely changed. Before, all I could see was what I had lost. Now I'm starting to see what I still have. You've brought something into my life that I didn't even know I needed." Kate frowned slightly, as though trying to grasp where he was heading. "Thomas, we've just tried to help. You've been working so hard on your recovery, and it's not just that," he interrupted, not wanting to seem rude but needing to be clear. "It's about you. what you've brought into my life. Your strength, your patience, the love you have for Lily. All of it has changed the way I see things. And I feel something for you, Kate. Something beyond gratitude. The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. Kate lowered her gaze for a moment, visibly taken aback. She didn't respond immediately, as though carefully processing Thomas's words. When she finally lifted her eyes, her expression held a mix of emotion and caution. "Thomas, I don't know what to say," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't expect to hear this from you. And, to be honest, I've been trying to ignore what I feel because I'm not sure it would be right." "What do you feel?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. His expression was a blend of hope and apprehension. Kate took a deep breath, as if summoning the courage to admit what she had been suppressing. "I feel something for you too," she finally confessed. "But I have to think about Lily, about how this would change everything for her. And for both of us." Thomas nodded, understanding her hesitation. He knew what he was feeling was real, but he also recognized that Kate had responsibilities that extended beyond her own emotions. "I don't want to pressure you," he said sincerely. "I just needed you to know. What you and Lily have brought into my life is something I never want to lose." Kate stood slowly, pausing beside his chair. "Thank you for being honest, Thomas. That means a lot to me. And I promise I'll think about all of this." She left the room, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts. He knew he had taken an important step, but also realized he would need patience as Kate worked through her own feelings. That night, the mansion's silence felt deeper than usual. Thomas stayed in the garden for hours, staring up at the star-filled sky. His mind was crowded with thoughts about his conversation with Kate. He felt a mixture of relief for finally expressing his feelings and overwhelming anxiety about how things might change. For the first time in a long while, he had no control over what would come next, and the uncertainty left him restless. Meanwhile, Kate sat in Lily's room, watching her daughter sleep. The little girl clutched one of the drawings she had made that afternoon. Simple but deeply meaningful. Herself, Kate, and Thomas sitting together in the garden. Kate felt the weight of responsibility pressing on her chest. She knew her daughter was happy here, perhaps more than anywhere else they had lived, but doubts still lingered. She wondered if she was being fair to Thomas, to herself, and most importantly, to Lily. The next morning, Kate came downstairs to find Thomas already in the living room. He was flipping through a book, though he seemed distracted. When he saw her, he closed the book and watched her silently for a moment before speaking. "Kate, I know I laid a lot on you yesterday," he began, his voice calm but laced with emotion. "And I want you to know I'm not expecting an immediate answer. I just want you to do what's best for you and Lily." Kate offered a faint smile as she sat on the couch opposite him. "I've thought a lot about what you said, Thomas, and what you've given me and Lily here is something I never expected to find. You've given us more than just a place to stay. You've given us safety, support, and something I didn't even realize was missing: hope." Thomas stayed quiet, allowing her to continue. "But," she said hesitantly, "this is a big step. It's not just about us. Lily has already grown attached to you, and if this doesn't work out, it would be hard for her. For me too." "I understand," Thomas replied, feeling the weight of her words. "I would never do anything to hurt you or Lily, but I want you to know that I'm willing to try, if you are." Kate looked at him, her eyes reflecting a mix of fear and longing. She knew she was opening herself up to something that could change their lives, but she also knew, deep down, that she was already invested in a way she could no longer deny. "Then maybe we can try," she said at last, her voice almost a whisper. Slowly, one step at a time, Thomas felt a wave of relief and joy wash over him. He nodded, smiling softly. Slowly is perfect. That evening, they had dinner together as usual, but something was different. The tension that had lingered between them for weeks seemed to have lifted, replaced by a sense of anticipation. Lily, unaware of what had transpired, laughed and told stories throughout the meal, while Thomas and Kate exchanged glances that spoke volumes, saying more than words ever could. After dinner, Kate put Lily to bed. The little girl fell asleep quickly, lulled by her mother's affection. Kate then went to Thomas's room to help him with anything he needed. As she entered, he surprised her with a gentle invitation. "Sit here with me. Let's admire the stars." She sat down next to him, and the two of them gazed at the sky full of bright spots. The silence between them was full of meaning. Then, gently, Thomas touched her face. Their eyes met, and the world around them seemed to stop. Their hearts beat frantically, as if each pulse brought them closer together. Thomas held Kate's head affectionately, and without haste, their lips came together in a long, passionate kiss. It was as if that instant marked the beginning of something profoundly transformative in their lives. When their lips parted, Thomas sighed and confessed, "I've been waiting for this moment with such anticipation. I've been dreaming of this kiss for days." Kate smiled, her eyes shining like the stars outside. "This is so much more than I ever dared to dream." Months had passed since the night Kate and Thomas decided to try something together, and the transformation in their lives was undeniable. The mansion, once silent and cold, was now a place full of life. Lily's laughter was a constant presence, echoing through the halls, and the moments the three of them shared brought a sense of family none of them had experienced before. With Kate's support, Thomas devoted himself wholeheartedly to physical therapy. He faced difficult days marked by pain and frustration, but also small milestones that filled him with hope. Kate was always by his side, encouraging him with kind words and her unwavering presence. Every movement he regained, every sign of progress was celebrated as a collective victory. On a bright, sunny day, they decided to take a trip to the city park. It was a place Kate had often visited with Lily before moving to the mansion, and Thomas suggested they revisit it together. They brought a picnic basket, games, and Lily's drawing notebook. As Lily ran across the lawn with a radiant smile, Thomas watched the scene, feeling a warmth in his chest he hadn't felt in years. "I never thought I'd be here like this," he said, looking at Kate beside him. She smiled, placing her hand lightly over his. "Neither did I," she replied. "But sometimes the best things happen when we least expect them." Thomas turned to face her. "You and Lily have transformed my life, Kate. You brought meaning to a place that once felt empty. And more than that, you've taught me what truly matters." Kate remained silent, her emotions reflected in her eyes. Before she could respond, Lily ran up to them, hiding something behind her back. "Close your eyes," she said excitedly. They complied, and Lily placed a crown made of flowers on Thomas's head. "Now you're a real king of the park and our garden," she declared, laughing. Thomas and Kate joined in her laughter, but the gesture carried a symbolic weight that all three seemed to feel. That evening, back at the mansion, Thomas made a decision. He asked Kate to meet him in the garden, where everything felt more peaceful under the soft moonlight. She followed him, curious, and found him standing, supported by crutches he had started using in recent weeks. It was the first time she had seen him out of the wheelchair since they arrived. "Thomas," she began, her voice filled with emotion, but he raised his hand to stop her. "I'm not fully back yet, but every step I take is because of you too," he said, gripping one of the crutches firmly. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box, lowering himself carefully onto one knee to face Kate. "You brought light into my life when I thought everything was lost. Kate Miller, would you do me the honor of being my wife and building a life by my side?" Kate was speechless, tears streaming down her face as Lily, who had been watching from the porch, started clapping and running toward them. "Say yes, Mommy," Kate laughed, mixing the sound with joyful sobs. "Yes, Thomas," she said, holding his face gently in her hands. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They kissed beneath the stars as Lily wrapped them both in a warm hug, completing the picture of a future that now seemed brighter than ever. If you enjoyed this video, let us know in the comments. Your opinion is very important to us. Don't forget to subscribe. A big hug, and see you in the next video.